Why did Rolex, above every other luxury watch, become the true presidential watch? The answer lies in a story of power, symbolism, and horology where a timepiece became more than metal. It became a political language. From Eisenhower's Rolex Datejust on a Life magazine cover to the Day-Date that earned the nickname The President, each moment cemented Rolex as shorthand for status and authority. In this video, we'll journey through history in 4 parts: its origins in politics, the iconic milestones, the cultural symbolism, and the modern implications that prove why Rolex still rules the presidential wrist. Let's start. Part 1. Before the President: How Rolex Entered Politics. A gold Rolex appeared on a future president's wrist in 1952, yet it was not the model the world now calls the president. Where did the myth truly begin? However, the answer begins where power meets practicality, because politics adopts objects that refuse to fail under pressure. Meanwhile, Rolex earned its first passport to public office with water sealed out and energy sealed in, turning engineering into a quiet promise. On the other hand, that promise mattered because leaders live in motion, not in display, and their tools must keep pace without drama. As a consequence of this, utility arrived first and reputation followed like a shadow. Even so, function alone is not destiny, because symbolism requires a stage and a silhouette the public can learn at a glance. Meanwhile, Rolex taught that silhouette in 3 strokes that cameras love. The date at 3 delivered legibility in a single glance. The fluted bezel caught light like a reliable headline, and the rolling cadence of a signature bracelet made motion look intentional. On the other hand, these lines did more than please designers. They trained viewers to read authority with their eyes before they heard a word. The outline began to speak. By the way, you'll never truly know what's hidden behind a presidential watch until you subscribe. Unlock the secrets of Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Cartier before history slips through your fingers. What many did not see coming was how a single photograph would fuse that outline to the highest office. In the summer of 1952, a magazine cover placed a general turned candidate in a formal pose where the wrist was not a prop but a proof. However, the watch on that wrist was not the later icon with the day spelled it known. It was a gold Datejust engraved for rank and service, a chronometer that told a story as clearly on the caseback as on the dial. Meanwhile, the image burned a link into public memory that functioned like a seal. The rest signed the moment. On the other hand, the photograph worked because it balanced pride with restraint at a time when the nation demanded steadiness more than spectacle. Even so, the watch looked competent rather than loud, confident rather than theatrical, and princely rather than princely, which made the association feel earned. As a consequence of this, the bond between measured luxury and public service formed before any nickname existed. The bond predates the myth. Meanwhile, provenance hardened the aura because the watch's path through aides and family left a trail of letters, service slips, and photographs that could be checked. However, verification matters when symbols are born, since myths collapse where records are thin. Even so, here the chain held and strengthened the meaning for anyone willing to test it. As a consequence of this, authenticity amplified the message the way a well-kept archive amplifies a speech. The evidence kept the legend honest. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the image is imprinted. However, the story of Eisenhower's wrist is not only about a photograph. It is about what the object implied each time he extended a hand. Meanwhile, the gold case read as achievement without ostentation, the date as readiness, and the certified movement as a temperament tuned to accuracy in small things. On the other hand, those cues allowed a democratic elite to wear luxury that looked like duty rather than indulgence. As a consequence of this, the camera learned to recognize fluting as competence. The bezel became a badge. Even so, the Datejust also taught a lesson that would shape the next decade, because it proved a leader could wear a luxury watch daily without coddling it. Meanwhile, Practicality became the alibi that let prestige sit at the same desk as policy. On the other hand, that alibi would prove essential when a more assertive model stepped onto the stage. The ground was prepared for visibility with a conscience. The stage was set for a louder symbol. The rival tradition, the alarm that rang duty. What many did not see coming is that another tradition rose at the same time, one that framed power as duty rather than display. However, the mechanical alarm on a certain watch rang like a briefing bell at dawn, reminding its wearer that time serves the task, not the title. Meanwhile, gifts of that alarm watch to presidents created a parallel storyline in which function spoke first and optics followed. On the other hand, that storyline mattered because it kept ambition tethered to service in the public imagination. Duty kept time audibly. Even so, function speaks softly unless the room falls quiet, and politics rarely grant silence. As a consequence of this, a contest began to unfold between the sound a leader hears and the sight an audience reads. Meanwhile, the audible watch won mornings and private meetings, while the visible watch won photographs and broadcasts. On the other hand, the age of mass media rewards what a lens can recognize instantly. Visibility slowly gained the upper hand. John F. Kennedy, minimalist diplomacy. Meanwhile, a younger decade stepped forward and asked for elegance that could float on television without losing weight. However, the rule that the wrist speaks remained in force, because image was policy in a world that now lived through screens. On the other hand, the choice of slim profiles and quiet geometry argued for a new kind of authority that relied on proportion rather than bulk. As a consequence of this, the wrist refined its grammar while keeping its voice. Minimal lines carried maximum intent. Even so, this chapter matters to our story because it bridged the space between competence and charisma, preparing the public eye to accept a stronger symbol without reading it as vanity. Meanwhile, fine dress pieces whispered diplomacy, while the camera taught millions to read the smallest details of a leader's presentation. On the other hand, that visual literacy created a hunger for a watch that could summarize identity in a single glance. The audience was ready for shorthand. The camera learns a new alphabet. What many did not see coming was how television would turn outlines into icons, because grainy pictures demand bolder shapes. However, a fluted ring around the dial behaves like stage lighting, and a window that spells the day at noon behaves like a headline. Meanwhile, a bracelet with short, rounded links drapes like a metal ribbon, making the whole assembly read as seniority at a glance. On the other hand, those traits are not accidents. They are design choices that reward the lens. The design became a language. Even so, the path to that stronger symbol would have meant little without the groundwork already laid by the earlier photograph and the years of steady visibility. As a consequence of this, when a new model finally arrived, the public did not need an explanation. Meanwhile, the office needed a watch it could wear daily. The camera needed a silhouette it could recognize instantly, and the culture needed a nickname it could repeat. The conditions aligned perfectly. Why politics took Rolex in. However, the deeper reason politics adopted Rolex lies beyond metal and marketing, because the brand presented reliability as character and character as qualification. Meanwhile, waterproof cases spoke of resilience, self-winding spoke of independence, and precision spoke of respect for detail. On the other hand, those values echoed the virtues a nation asks of its leaders, which made the translation from watchmaker to statesman feel natural. The virtues matched the office. Even so, status never acted alone, because scarcity without service would have stranded the symbol on a pedestal. As a consequence of this, ready servicing and robust construction allowed prestige to function as a tool, which preserved the moral balance that public life demands. Meanwhile, that balance kept luxury from seeming like license and kept authority from seeming like arrogance. The tool justified the treasure. What many did not see coming is that by the time the louder symbol arrived, the public had already learned to read the wrist as a sentence. However, the earlier bond with the White House meant the next model would not be a stranger, but an evolution. On the other hand, when a television-era leader made that model impossible to miss, the nickname would attach itself not by decree, but by repetition. The culture would weld name to metal. Part 2, Birth of the Icon, Day-Date 1956, and the Johnson Effect. One watch put the day in letters at 12 and the date at 3. Another man's wrist then welded a nickname to metal forever. Which moment mattered more? However, the story opens not with a slogan but with engineering that solved a human problem in public. Because the day-date of 1956 made information legible at a glance. Meanwhile, the spelled day at the top of the dial turned the calendar into a headline that even a grainy camera could read. On the other hand, the companion date at 3 made routine scheduling feel frictionless in a life ruled by minutes. The outline finally had a voice. Even so, innovation alone would have vanished without a frame that dignified it. Because Rolex wrapped the mechanism in precious metal only, refusing steel for this model. As a consequence of this, the watch announced seniority without a word, by using gold and platinum as its uniform. Meanwhile, precious metal carried a political subtext that cameras understood in milliseconds. Rank appeared before speech. On the other hand, a bracelet can speak as clearly as a case, and the new semicircular 3-link design did exactly that. Even so, its drape behaved like a metal ribbon that never clanked, a river of polished links that read as ceremony while it worked like armor. Meanwhile, the name would later lift from bracelet to watch through repetition and myth. The strap taught the title. What many did not see coming is that the day-date's geometry was made for television long before anyone wrote copy about it. However, a fluted bezel acts like stage lighting, throwing crisp shadows and highlights that a lens catches easily. Meanwhile, the day aperture sits where the human eye expects a masthead, so recognition happens without effort. The dial behaved like print. Even so, the case avoided bulk because authority does not need size when design does the speaking. As a consequence of this, the modest diameter wore under a cuff, while the weight underlined seriousness when the cuff moved. Meanwhile, the crown logo at 12 served as a discreet seal of office without crossing into costume. Gravity lived in the metal. On the other hand, practicality remained the moral alibi that kept luxury honest, because the oyster case still sealed out weather and the perpetual rotor still banked motion into power. Even so, a chronometer certificate meant the seconds hand obeyed, which in politics reads as respect for detail. Meanwhile, the message was clear for those who listen to objects. Reliability is character. 1956, the day-date steps on stage. However, a debut is only a debut until culture answers, and culture answered when the day-date's distinct face met the era of nightly news. Meanwhile, television compressed character into outlines that could be recognized across a living room. On the other hand, the watch offered exactly the lines the medium wanted to memorize. The sketch became a symbol. Even so, language lagged the image at first, because brochures named bracelets while citizens named watches. As a consequence of this, the term that belonged to the band began to slide toward the head until the public could not tell them apart. Meanwhile, collectors might quibble, but voters spoke by habit, not by catalog. Culture rewrote the label. Lyndon B. Johnson, visibility with weight. What many did not see coming was how often one wrist would keep the day-date in frame, because Lyndon B. Johnson wore yellow gold like a sentence that ended every speech. However, the watch was not a cameo, it was a constant, appearing in press conferences, desk photos, and handshakes until the shape felt inevitable. Meanwhile, repetition is how icons form in memory. the lens learned the outline. On the other hand, Johnson's political style suited the watch's frankness because he governed as a presence and the watch performed presence on cue. Even so, the fluted rang and the masthead day did not whisper, they stated, and the camera gave them the floor whenever sleeve shifted. Meanwhile, visibility became doctrine without a single line of policy. The wrist finished the argument. As a consequence of this, the nickname rooted itself not by decree but by inspection, because the public had already decided what they were seeing. However, once a shape becomes shorthand, even critics use the shorthand to be understood. Meanwhile, the language circled back and blessed the object that taught it. The title stuck because eyes agreed. Why the nickname refused to leave? Even so, a nickname cannot endure on glamour alone, because a leader's seasons are rough and a watch must travel all of them. As a consequence of this, serviceability and sturdiness made the Day-Date more than a podium prop. Meanwhile, bracelets were resized, movements were serviced, dials were swapped for legibility, and the thing kept working. Endurance defended prestige. On the other hand, exclusivity did its own work quietly, because the absence of steel kept the model from becoming everyone's badge. Even so, scarcity sharpened the edge of the silhouette so that when it appeared, it meant something beyond price. Meanwhile, a symbol gains force when it is not omnipresent yet is always recognized. Presence beat ubiquity decisively. What many did not see coming is that the Day-Date also solved a problem that politics cannot admit in words, because it gives a leader an object that looks ceremonial while it performs practical labor. However, a meeting still needs a clear read of the day and the date when calendars mutate hourly. Meanwhile, the watch dignifies the mundane while the mundane keeps the state running. Ceremony served logistics,
the media engine that made it inevitable. Even so, the 1960s built the pipeline the icon needed, because photo wire services and television syndicated images at a speed that earlier ages could not match. As a consequence of this, the same silhouette hit millions of eyes within days, then hit them again the following week. Meanwhile, repetition braided habit with recognition until correction felt pedantic. Memory outran. Footnote. On the other hand, advertising rarely had to force the association because editorial did the heavy lifting. Even so, a candid handshake can sell a symbol more effectively than a paid spread, and the Day-Date lived where candid photos lived. Meanwhile, newsprint, evening broadcasts, and later documentaries recycled the shape until it belonged to everyone. The archive kept teaching. The design grammar you can read at 10 paces. However, the reason the watch still reads today is simple and technical, because light loves edges and humans love headlines. Meanwhile, the fluted ring gives light teeth, the day window gives copy, and the bracelet gives motion a liquid border that the eye can follow. On the other hand, that trio makes the watch legible in the corner of a frame. Recognition happens instantly. Even so, the modest footprint prevents the image from swallowing the man, which is essential in politics where tools must never look like theatrics. As a consequence of this, the piece looks appointed rather than adorned, official rather than ornamental. Meanwhile, the balance allows authority to remain the subject while the watch remains the verb. Grammar holds the sentence. The consequence for every risk that followed. What many did not see coming is how the Day-Date's success would bend every later choice around it, because once a culture has a template, it compares everything else to the template. However, a steel classic now reads as restraint, a plastic tool as humility, and a gold flagship as momentum precisely because the Day-Date taught the scale. Meanwhile, the code governs even when the watch is absent. The template anchors meaning. On the other hand, the icon could have failed if any of its parts failed, which is why the alliance of innovation, precious metal, bracelet design, and relentless visibility mattered together. Even so, remove the day headline and the lens loses the masthead. Remove the fluting and the light goes flat. Remove the bracelet and the drape loses seniority. Meanwhile, the parts conspire to become a single word. The word was authority. Part 3. Consolidation and Countercurrents, 1970s to 2000s. The icon spread across ministries worldwide, while another story unfolded at home. The crown traveled with power abroad, even as America rediscovered humility on the wrist. Could the symbol survive restraint? However, the global map tells the first half of this chapter, because cabinets, courts, and central banks from Europe to the Middle East adopted the gold outline as portable insignia. Meanwhile, motorcades in distant capitals flashed fluted light from car doors to podiums, teaching new audiences the same silhouette. On the other hand, the message translated without subtitles, because shape outruns language in politics. The outline spoke in every tongue. Even so, the consolidation abroad depended on a grammar learned earlier, since the trio of fluted bezel, day headline, and draped links read instantly on official film. As a consequence of this, state photographers built archives where the watch functioned like a seal next to flags and coats of arms. Meanwhile, each reused image hardened the association for the next administration. Repetition minted authority anew.
Ronald Reagan. Continuity without excess. On the other hand, American imagery of the 1980s kept the Rolex link alive even without the flagship Day-Date, because a date just appeared often enough to coach the eye. However, the choice suited a leader who preferred reassurance over spectacle, since a classic dial and Jubilee cadence looked like policy steadied by habit. Meanwhile, the camera accepted the compromise because legibility still carried. Continuity beat novelty softly. What many did not see coming is that visibility can be moderated without losing meaning, as a simpler reference still signals the same virtues when the silhouette is familiar. Even so, the fluted ring and timeless case allowed a softer claim to authority to travel through photos and evening news. As a consequence of this, Rolex equaled executive presence even when gold stepped back. The grammar stayed intact. Without subscribing, the next time you see a world leader's wrist, you'll have no idea what power, symbolism, or status it really signals. Subscribe today or keep watching in the dark. Bill Clinton, Plain Folk Optics. Meanwhile, the 1990s pivoted the storyline because the nation grew hungry for access rather than altitude, and a plastic digital watch arrived like a handshake. However, the Timex on an inauguration stage reframed power as fitness and focus and daily discipline, not gilded certainty. On the other hand, this did not erase the old code. It challenged it with a different promise. Approachability became the headline. Even so, the effect proved larger than the price tag, as the resin case and lap counter transmitted an ethic of work you could emulate at home. As a consequence of this, late-night jokes and magazine spreads multiplied the image until the humble watch became a cultural shorthand for the era. Meanwhile, the paradox sharpened the lesson for everyone watching. Cheap can be priceless. What many did not see coming was the second act that followed Office, when that same wrist studied horology with curiosity and range, adding serious mechanical pieces to the personal story. However, this two-step arc did not contradict the early message. It completed it by separating public optics from private passion. Meanwhile, the audience learned that context chooses the case. Roles define the dial. George W. Bush, duty over display. On the other hand, the early 2000s returned the stage to duty, as crisis reshaped expectations about what a leader should wear. However, a Timex with a small flag at 12 performed punctuality rather than prestige, as luminous hands worked through briefings and tarmacs. Meanwhile, the vocabulary remained strictly utilitarian and therefore persuasive. Duty eclipsed display cleanly. Even so, symbolism traveled beyond the West Wing when a related model appeared later in a presidential center shop, letting citizens wear the narrative at cost. As a consequence of this, the idea of work over wealth became something people could strap on daily.
Meanwhile, the glow of Indiglo lighted commutes as well as situation rooms in imagination. Symbols traveled by strap. What many did not see coming is how sturdiness and forgettable comfort can be as communicative as precious metal when the room demands seriousness. However, politics still needed a template to measure these choices against, and the template remained gold fluting and a day headline. Meanwhile, even absence pointed back to the icon it resisted. The shadow held shape, risks, rooms, and the optics of gold. On the other hand, gold did not vanish from power, it learned the timetable of risk, because recessions and scandals punish shine while expansions forgive it. Even so, leaders and staff quietly mapped which rooms welcomed visibility and which rooms required steel or dress minimalism. As a consequence of this, the symbol survived by obeying context rather than forcing it. Fit became the law. Meanwhile, the same lesson guided speechwriters and protocol chiefs, because a watch that overpowers a policy moment undermines the message it hopes to support. However, a watch that underlines the moment without drawing fire is a better ally than a headline that steals its own stage. On the other hand, the object must serve the sentence, not replace it. Grammar over volume always.
Brand behavior, scarcity, and service. Even so, the icon could not have endured without a brand strategy that made prestige practical, since scarcity without service turns symbols brittle. As a consequence of this, a worldwide network of trained benches and parts kept important watches running like legislation on schedule. Meanwhile, routine maintenance turned ceremony into tool again. Service defended status quietly. On the other hand, design consistency did its own long work, because fluted bezels, durable case profiles, and bracelet families taught generations the same alphabet. Even so, incremental improvements hid beneath familiar lines so that the outline remained legible while technology advanced. As a consequence of this, cameras never had to relearn the wrist. Consistency preserved cognition. The template governs even when absent. Meanwhile, the cumulative effect of decades of images made the day-date a yardstick that later choices could not avoid. However, a steel Datejust now read as restraint, a digital Timex as humility, and a gold flagship as momentum precisely because the template set the scale. On the other hand, this is how symbols mature. They define their opposites. The yardstick rules the aisle. Even so, the global stage kept feeding the archive with ministers and monarchs who preferred the gold headline at noon, which meant the symbol flourished even when American optics downshifted. As a consequence of this, the icon never left the world feed, only the domestic frame. Meanwhile, the myth grew international legs. The crown traveled well. The pendulum's lesson. What many did not see coming is that the back and forth between status and accessibility did not weaken the day-date. It clarified its function. However, the gold icon thrives best when the room wants statement, while the humble tool thrives when the room wants solidarity. Meanwhile, a leader who knows which hour he is in owns both codes. Timon writes the message. Part 4. New Media Era and the Verdict. Why Day-Date Won the Culture. Some watches whisper at handshake distance, while others shout from 10 meters. In the age of HD and social feeds, which voice endures? Barack Obama. Obtainable momentum, then quiet. Refinement. Obama's early wrist chose an accessible chronograph whose story began as a gift from those charged to protect him, which made service precede style. However, the symmetry of the dial photographed cleanly across debates, town halls, and election night, turning attainability into energy. Meanwhile, audiences could buy in rather than only look in. Access became momentum. Even so, the post office pivot to a slim dress piece reset the tone from campaign electricity to private poise, as if the narrative moved from stadium to study.
As a consequence of this, refinement replaced pushers with polished indices and replaced noise with measure. Meanwhile, the shift did not erase the earlier message. It matured it. Refinement closed the arc. Donald Trump, visibility as thesis. On the other hand, Trump's stage favored metal that reads from 20 rows back, and the Day-Date re-entered U.S. politics as a headline you could spot before a word. However, yellow gold fluting, a masthead day at noon, and a weight that anchors a cuff turned the wrist into broadcast. Meanwhile, the outline became the argument in a single glance. Visibility became doctrine. What many did not see coming is how geometry can compress biography, since an ellipse adds pure form, while a square-lined piece adds vintage pedigree to the same frame. Even so, mass and polish risk fatigue if every scene shouts at equal volume, because repetition prints brand while it also invites blowback. As a consequence of this, the strategy courts both recognition and risk. Recognition cuts both ways. Joe Biden, calibrated steel, inherited gravity. Meanwhile, Biden's oath chose steel and blue on a familiar date just that glints without glare, threading continuity with caution. However, that chord felt appropriate to a season that prized steadiness over spectacle, letting the office speak louder than the object. On the other hand, Heritage still rolled the bracelet without tipping into ceremony. Balance looked like policy. Even so, his rotation told a broader story as a Seamaster handled daily duty, a Speedmaster nodded to national memory, and a Seiko kept factory floor credibility alive on the trail. As a consequence of this, the toolkit read as work first, symbol second, with the occasional alarm watch quietly linking back to older traditions. Meanwhile, steel carried gravity without gold, gravity without glare. Why the Day-Date works politically, the semiotics. However, the Day-Date's edge remains technical and visible, because light loves teeth and voters love headlines. Meanwhile, a fluted bezel throws crisp highlights, a day aperture at 12 behaves like a masthead, and the dial's balance survives even when cropped by sleeves. On the other hand, recognition occurs before comprehension, which is why the shape wins frames. Recognition beats explanation. Even so, the model carries unusual message density since one glance translates as stability, continuity, competence, and success without calling for narration. As a consequence of this, the wrist supplies context that words only reinforce, not create, which saves attention in noisy rooms. Meanwhile, politics spends attention like currency. Legibility pays immediately. On the other hand, exclusivity by design keeps meaning sharp, because the absence of steel prevents the icon from becoming everyone's badge. Even so, precious metal restrains ubiquity, which increases symbolic voltage when the watch does appear. As a consequence of this, sight equals statement in rooms that measure hierarchy. Scarcity concentrates signal. Meanwhile, practicality remains the moral alibi that keeps prestige from curdling, because the oyster case and perpetual rotor still do their jobs daily. However, chronometer accuracy continues to narrate character as respect for detail, which audiences intuit even if they cannot quote the standard. On the other hand, credibility grows when ceremony works. Credibility wears well. Even so, bracelet psychology does work the case cannot, since the short, rounded links of the so-called president bracelet drape like a ribbon while flexing like armor. As a consequence of this, motion reads as seniority rather than flash, delivering status in the grammar of restraint. Meanwhile, drape teaches rank without noise. Drape signals rank. What many did not see coming is that the nickname president originally traveled with the bracelet more than the head, and culture, not catalog, fused them. However, repetition across televised decades welded word to metal until pedantry lost the argument. Meanwhile, language follows usage in politics.
usage writes dictionaries. On the other hand, the first presidential Rolex most people remembered was not a day-date at all, because an earlier gold date just on a 1952 cover preloaded the bond. Even so, that photograph taught cameras to read fluting as competence long before the day window existed. As a consequence of this, the day-date inherited equity it did not mint alone. Equity arrived early. Meanwhile, you cannot erase the functional lineage either, because Vulcan's alarm tradition is real and honorable, a duty bell strapped to responsibility. However, mass media rewards what lenses can decode instantly, which tilted the contest toward visible status rather than audible service. On the other hand, both lineages remain true. Two truths, one stage.